Okay, panelists, we are now live on both Zoom and Facebook, and you can switch your cameras on. Welcome Sahar, welcome Yavar, welcome Michael, wonderful to have you. Welcome to everyone at home as well. Good afternoon or good evening, depending upon where you are. Thank you for joining us and for tuning in. This is the event Defending Palestinian Civil Society, Understanding Canada's Role. And today we're joined by Michael Lynk, Yavar Hameed, Sahar Francis, and soon Susan Power will also be joining us. So my name is Bianca Wajeni. I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. I'll be moderating today's event. We are the co-host and co-organizers of the event. You can find out more about our work at foreignpolicy.ca. The event is also co-presented by Just Peace Advocates, an incredible organization. You can find out about them at justpeaceadvocates.ca. So I'm coming to you live from Montreal, or Jojage, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone at home. Please tell us where you're tuning in from. You know, the chat is open, but please do, as always, keep your comments civil, free from racist, sexist, xenophobic, or otherwise harmful commentary. So hi, I can already see people are saying hello. Hello, Michael. Hi, Karen, Lorraine, Robert. Great to hear from you. So after our speakers give their initial remarks, we'll be opening up to questions from the audience. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, which you can see is at the bottom of your screen. It's much easier for us to find those there than it is to find them in the chat. You can see there's already 126 people, 127 people on the call. That is wonderful. It's great to see this level of engagement around such an important topic. So again, I'm here with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, or CFPI, and we challenge unjust foreign policy measures, and we aim to bridge the gap between the reality and perception of Canada's role in the world. We also work to oppose the racism that's embedded in Canada's foreign policy. And our organization is reliant on donations from our community. So please do find out more about that at foreignpolicy.ca/donation. As I had mentioned, this event is co-presented by Just Peace Advocates, who are a Canadian organization that promote just peace through the rule of law and respect for human rights in Canada and around the world for Palestinian people and those that stand in solidarity for the human rights of Palestinian people. So many thanks to the executive director, Karen Rodman, for all her work to bring today together's event. Thank you, Karen. You can find out more about them, like I said, at justpeaceadvocates.ca. Karen's also going to be behind the scenes today, so if you have any questions, any technical questions, please do chat with her directly. So for today's event, on August 18th, the Israeli military raided the offices of 7 prominent Palestinian civil society organizations, destroying property, seizing files, welding the entrances to the offices shut. And for too long, Canada has been complicit with Israel's abuses. And this ranges from substantial historic support for Zionism to the ongoing backing of Israel that we see. And so for background, you can watch our talk, The Innumerable Ways Canada Supports Israeli Apartheid, which is on YouTube. And for today's topic, there's direct complicity, as Michael and Yavar and others will detail. Ottawa refused to condemn the earlier designation of 6 of the groups as terrorist organizations, which has emboldened Israel's most recent actions. By criminalizing much of Palestinian political life, Canada's terrorist list legitimates Israel by designating Palestinian groups, civil society groups, as terrorists. There has been some good developments in Canada. There has been some opposition. On August 26th, the NDP leader, New Democrat Party leader, Jagmeet Singh sent an email calling on the Liberals to condemn the Israeli government's attacks on civil society in Israel and Palestine, including the recent designation of 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terrorists. And this was one of 13 demands that Singh made of the Trudeau government on Palestinian rights. And this truly represents a remarkable shift in his and in the party policy and an important step forward for the Palestinian struggle in Canada. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the evening. Sahar Francis is the General Director of Ramallah-Based Ademiya Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, which has been targeted by the Israeli government for their work. Welcome, Sahar.
Hello, good evening. Thank you a lot, Bianca and Karen, and I'm so delighted to see Michael and Yavar. Thanks for all the huge support you're offering us. Actually, it's a long history. It didn't started just last year with the designation decision in October. The Israeli attack against Palestinian civil society takes different forms and they implement different measures since decades. Since the beginning of the occupation, actually, Israel used the British security regulations and the military system, the military orders that they developed in order to illegalize and declare different groups, not just civil society organizations, humanitarian aid organizations, charitable organizations, student movements, political parties, unions, and all different groups that they were resisting the occupation and criticizing the occupation for the grave violations and the war crimes that they were committing systematically were targeted. And according to these Israeli military orders and lists, there's more than 450 different entities between organizations and political parties and unions and student movements that they are declared illegal. And specifically the attack on the civil society increased since 2004, actually, since the decision of the ICJ on the wall and the initiative made by the civil society on the PDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Then we started to feel more and more attack, and it all started with the attack and the smear campaign, the distribution of false information against us by Israeli right-wing organizations like NGO Monitor, like Regavim, Shurat Hadin, and other local organizations, and as well international Zionist organizations connected to the Israeli government like UN Watch, UK Lawyers for Israel, and other groups, that they were starting to distribute these reports about the work of the NGOs, claiming that we are terrorist organizations. And of course, mostly it was based on information taken from the military courts files or the secret information from the security services, because some of the workers in these organizations are connected to the Israeli security services. And all this campaign failed because our donors, our supporters were not affected. And this was the aim, to dry our resources. And actually the Israeli government invented the Strategic Affairs Ministry in the previous government in order to affect the work of the civil society, to silence the voices of the Palestinian activists. And they were attacking systematically the PDS and everyone that was active in the PDS, even in the international level, using the anti-Semitism claim in attacking all supporters. Damir office was raided several times, actually, in this context. So in 2012, in 2019, they raided the office. They stole and confiscated 11 laptops and 2 cameras and files, and they missed the content of the office. And they, of course, arrested several employees from Damir in different periods. Currently, we have 2 of our colleagues, the field researcher and the lawyer from East Jerusalem, but our colleague, the lawyer as well, Salah Hamouri, since he has dual citizenship, his Jerusalem residency was revoked as well a month after the designation, and he was arrested on March under administrative detention. So the harassment against the organizations and the human rights defenders can take as well more than one way. It could be imprisonment, detention under administrative detention, canceling family unification procedures. As in Salah's case, they also they rejected his family unification process. They confiscated his ID and they subjected him under arrest. They deported his wife back in the past. They are not allowing her to visit him now while he's in detention. They can ban travel, the human rights defenders like Shawan himself, the director of Al-Haq, was banned travel for several years before he was under arrest. Ubay, my colleague, the director of DSAN, he was banned travel lately in May by the Israeli authorities. Me, myself, I was banned from entering the United States when I wanted to attend the World Social Forum in Mexico. So there is lots of restrictions that we can face. And especially after the raid last Thursday, in a Damir office, the damage wasn't such serious like in the other colleagues' offices. They just sealed the doors and it seems they installed something in our server and compromised our network. But they hang this closing order that forcing the closure of the office for indefinite period. In other organizations, they literally took all the equipments and they confiscated everything that they could take with them in the truck that they brought. Since then, we're expecting actually the worst, because we know that they can now affect us more by attacking the banks. And you know that the banks in Palestine are so vulnerable. They are subjected for legal cases against them in the United States by the Israeli government and by individuals even inside Israel. So they are worried, and it could be the case that the Palestinian banks decides to freeze our accounts and to stop working with us. Physically, the Israeli army can raid the banks themselves and confiscate the money that we have in our accounts. They can arrest people, and they started with requesting some of the colleagues to show for interrogation, like in Al-Haq case, Shawan refused to attend the investigation, but other colleagues, they went just to receive a threatening message that you don't dare to open the organization, otherwise you will be arrested. Why they are doing all this? We believe that all this claim of being involved in terrorism, they themselves know that this is not accurate. And all the information, including the secret material, the secret dossier that they submitted to their close friends in the United States and in the different European countries that they support these organizations, were confirming that this information is not sufficient. And me as a lawyer working with the military court system, and I know exactly the file that was submitted against other colleagues in the healthcare committees. I know the evidences that they have against most of the employees and the organization, and I know, and I'm sure that it's not sufficient evidences in order to charge all these 7 organizations and the individuals working in these organizations. And this is why they are taking such measures. And unfortunately, instead of canceling their decision, because we were waiting for almost 1 year now for the pressure from the international level, because we believe that the Israelis will not cancel the decision by themselves unless if there's more pressure from the international community, they will not change their decision. So the statement that was issued by the 10 European countries were very important, were very supportive, but still it's not enough. So condemnation and statements will not help us in sustaining our work and protecting ourselves and keep working in the urgent and important issues that we are covering. What Israel is trying to seek by affecting the Palestinian civil society actually is continuing with the annexation plan that they are already implementing on the ground. Part of us works with supporting farmers in Area C, in confiscated land, in areas where the Israelis are planning to annex. And others are supporting women, children, and human rights in general. And the work on the international level versus the International Criminal Court, the work with the UN system, trying to exhaust every channel that we have in order to seek accountability, this is what bothers them. The change in the discourse, in the legal terminology that is used by international organizations, talking about apartheid more, about colonialist regime, and so on, by Amnesty, by Human Rights Watch, by other organizations, bothers them. This is why they are so keen in trying to silence us and shut us down. And this is, I will end by really sending a clear message to all the activists around the world. It's time for action. We should send a very clear message to our governments, to our parliamentarians, that it's not enough anymore to condemn what the Israeli practices are, what Israel is doing on the daily basis. Just tomorrow in Palestine, in the 1st of September, 1,000 prisoners out of 4,500 currently in the Israeli prison are planning to start an open hunger strike against all the collective punishments and the violations that the prison authority is imposing. One of the detainees that he's already more than 170 days under hunger strike, Khalil Awaudi, the administrative detainee, just yesterday, the Israeli High Court rejected his petition. So we're trying to exhaust all the different legal methods that we have, and we are not succeeding because this occupation is becoming more and more and more beyond the occupation. It's abnormal. The situation that they are imposing is abnormal. And I'm sure that Professor Michael will explain more in a very comprehensive legal way what I mean by saying that it's the time for actions and we cannot tolerate anymore just soft diplomacy from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Thank you for that clear presentation, for sharing this information during such a difficult time as well for you, a time of such great difficulty. It's truly reprehensible what has transpired. And, imploring the audience to heed your call for international solidarity and support. There are 186 people now participating in today's event. Hello to everyone. It's really great to see you. Please do find out how you can support Ademiya from these terrible raids and ongoing attacks on their important work. I look forward to hearing more from you, Sahar, in the Q&A at the end with the audience. And to the audience, you can find out more about Ademiya at addameer.org. We also ask that you share our action alert to the Canadian Foreign Minister, calling on Canada to hold Israel accountable for its mistreatment of children in Palestine and for silencing those organizations like Ademiya that advocate on their behalf. So I'll be sharing a little bit more information about that again later in the discussion. Thank you again, Sahar. So our next panelist of the evening/afternoon is Michael Lynk. Michael Lynk is a legal academic, associate professor at the University of Western Ontario, and the former United Nations Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Thank you to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for inviting me and for organizing this event. And I want to say how extraordinarily proud I am to be on the same panel as Sahar. I've known her for many years, and I obviously got to know her very well during my 6 years as Special Rapporteur. I have only the deepest admiration for her tenacity and for her leadership on human rights issues and what's happening to her and to the other 6 organizations in Palestine over the last number of years, and particularly over the last number of months, is a clear sign that of how effective they are. If you weren't so effective, you wouldn't have such pushback coming from the Israeli military with respect to that. And it's up to the rest of us to try to ensure that that kind of human rights space is protected for the to be able to be issue on the ground criticisms with respect to the administration of the Israeli occupation. I also want to say how pleased I am to appear with Yavar Hameed as well. I think I'm right, Yavar, is that you were once a student of mine at the University of Ottawa when I taught there about, was it 3 years ago, 4 years ago you were a student, Yavar? Okay, something like that. So a great pleasure to see you again, and I followed your career from afar. Before I begin to discuss Canada today, particularly with respect to the attacks against the Palestinian human rights organizations, can I just give a very brief history lesson with respect to Canada and Palestine? Because today, the 31st of August, is the 75th anniversary of the release of the majority report by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which was released on the 31st of August, 1947. The majority plan advocated the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state, and the internationalization of Jerusalem. And I make this connection both because it is the anniversary, but also because it set in motion the partition resolution that was passed 3 months later by the UN General Assembly, Resolution 181, which then led to the creation of the State of Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinians, including 750,000 Palestinians who were forced into exile and not allowed to return back. Why am I giving you this brief history lesson? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, Ivan Rand, who was a Supreme Court of Canada Justice at that time, was one of the members of the 11-member UNSCOP committee, and he was one of the strongest advocates for the partition plan to go through. And he and Lester Pearson, who at that time was the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs in Canada, were the 2 strongest voices in Canada for the partition of Palestine. And much, I think, can be laid on their laps for what has occurred afterwards. The partition plan was, and I'm looking at this through research that I've been doing, was called by The Economist magazine, a very conservative magazine, in its report on the UNSCOP report in early September 1947 as both unjust and unworkable. Because it wound up giving a third of the population, the settler immigrant population, almost 2/3 of the land of Palestine, both of its ports, almost all of its industries, and almost all of its citrus industry as well. We know that then from the resolution in 1947 led to the war in 1948. The one thing I would say is that the partition of a country today, where it's against the fervent wishes of its majority indigenous population, and in order to benefit a settler population, would never occur today. What happened in the United Nations 75 years ago, in 1947, was in large part because the UN, made up then of only 57 countries, was largely made up of European countries, white settler colonial states like Canada, the United States, or Australia, or New Zealand, or South Africa, and Latin American states, which at those times ruled by Spanish descendant colonial elites. It was a much different UN then than it is now, and it could never happen, I believe, today. The second thing I want to be able to say in turning to the topic for today is the stance of Canada towards the Israel-Palestine issue. And when I looked the other day in preparation for this conversation, and I noticed on the website of Global Affairs Canada that it has as one of its lead pages a strong statement with respect to human rights defenders. It says that Canadians expect their governments to help build respect for human rights at home and around the world. And it offers guidelines on a how-to guide for supporting human rights defenders, as well as a clear statement on Canada's commitment for promoting all human rights. And they go on to define who a human rights defender is. They talk about how Canada is protecting human rights defenders internationally through bilateral and multilateral engagement. After I was done with that, I then looked to see what Canada had said with respect to the designation of the 6, later 7 Palestinian organizations as terrorist organizations, beginning with the formal designation that occurred late last October of 2021. And the only times I could find any statements is where the foreign minister would say, either in a statement or in the House of Commons, that Canada is carefully reviewing the information and is paying attention to what its allies are doing. I could find nothing where it's actually come out to condemn the designation of these organizations as a terrorist organizations, notwithstanding its statements that Canada believes in defending human rights space for defenders to be able to articulate rights and freedoms for all. Shortly after the raid earlier on this month in Ramallah and near Ramallah on the organizations and the ongoing designation of these organizations as both terrorist and illegal, the European Union representative to the Palestinian Authority led an important delegation of like-minded countries to the offices of Al-Haq, where it met with all of these organizations. They were made up largely of European countries, but also of like-minded countries outside of Europe, including Mexico and Chile. Canada has a representative's office in Ramallah. Canada was not among the countries that attended this meeting, and I'm unaware of any statement made since then by our Foreign Affairs Minister that is all critical of this. And this perhaps goes to a deeper issue with respect to human rights defenders. Back in the early 1990s, Canada did defend and Canada did fund human rights organizations in Palestine, including Al-Haq. That funding ended I believe in the early 2000s with the ascension of Stephen Harper to become the Prime Minister, and has never been renewed since. There is humanitarian funding to some organizations in Palestine, but nothing for the human rights defenders organizations that are critical of the Israeli occupation. And to me, it's perhaps consistent with Canada's recent policy and lack of action on this. When we look at what Canada said with respect to the release of the Trump plan in January 2020, Canada said, we are carefully examining the Trump plan, and we are consulting with our allies on that. It never did criticize the Trump plan's proposal for the annexation of much of the West Bank to Israel. You know, the European Union found time to be able to criticize the Trump plan. Pope Francis was able to criticize the Trump plan. We heard nothing with respect to this from Canada. The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement allows settlements in the illegal settlements that are a war crime under Canadian legislation, located in both East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, to be treated as part of Israel for the purposes of trade relations with Israel, which means that settlement products produced in these settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank can enter into Canada tariff-free. Other allies, such as South Korea, for example, when they negotiated a free trade agreement with Israel at the very same time, made sure that the free trade agreement only applied to the pre-67 boundaries of Israel. But Canada wound up defending its particular stance with respect to that. At the United Nations General Assembly, Canada has voted only twice in over 120 resolutions at the General Assembly since 2011 for resolutions in favor of Palestine. And those two resolutions, both of which affirmed the right to Palestinian self-determination in 2019 and 2020, were endorsed by Canada as a means of trying to secure a Security Council seat. Canada lost the vote in June of 2020 for its bid for a 2-year appointment to the Security Council, largely, well, not largely, but significantly on the basis of the fact that it has such a dismal record on Israel and Palestine. The only letter that the Canadian ambassador to the UN at the time released to other UN missions in New York canvassing them for support with respect to its bid for a Security Council seat was to be able to deflect criticism of its policy towards Israel and Palestine, which it was unsuccessful for. So all of those, I think, leads us to a situation where you would think Canada, if it is a champion of proclaiming human rights and defending the human rights defenders, would have had something to say with respect to what happened in the West Bank. It listens to the West Bank because it has a representative office there. This was widely in the press. Canada knows with respect to the dismal human rights trends that are going on in occupied Palestine, and yet it's maintained what I call its diplomatic laryngitis with respect to any criticism of Israel. So just if I can conclude, I just want to be able to say that this was an item as special rapporteur, and I was special rapporteur until the end of April of this year, where I released a number of statements and wrote a number of letters in my capacity to both governments, but also released public statements where I was joined with it by a number of other special rapporteurs in the UN special procedures system. And what I pointed out was that, and let me just quote this, I said, the United Nations has been very clear that the drafting and application of anti-terrorism laws has to be rigorously consistent with international law and human rights protections, including the principles of legal certainty, necessity, proportionality, and the rule of law. Applying anti-terrorism laws to well-regarded human rights defenders and civil society organizations without persuasive evidence to substantiate these claims can only be understood as a politically motivated attempt by Israel to silence some of its most effective critics. If the international community is serious about its support for Palestinian self-determination and an end to the 55-year-old Israeli occupation, it must become more vocal and assertive in defending these organizations. I'm pleased we see this defense with respect to the coming from Europe and coming from like-minded nations. But I ask myself, where is Canada? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a great question. Where is Canada? Thank you for providing this broader context and also the important history. There's so many contradictions when it comes to Canada, Canada's record on Palestine. And I urge people to look at the article that Karen has shared called Canada's Contradictions on Palestine in Electronic Intifada. Michael, thank you for pointing out these double standards, the lack of support for Palestinian civil society from Canada, the lack of support for human rights defenders, and also the dismal voting record at the UN on Palestinian human rights. And thank you for all the work that you have been doing too, and did as a special rapporteur. I want to remind everyone to take a moment to write to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly. The link is in the chat. Karen has shared that, and this has already been sent by around 1,800 people, but please do add your voice to demand that the government of Canada pressure Israel to immediately rescind its designation of 7 Palestinian human rights organizations as unlawful, and to urge the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs to denounce Israel for targeting these NGOs and for ordering the raid and closure of their offices. We'll now be hearing from Yavar Hameed, who is a lawyer in Ontario with a focus on racial profiling, lawful expression, equality rights, prisoner rights, and migrant protection. Welcome, Yavar.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Thank you to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and to the fellow panelists. It's a great honor and privilege to be here with Sahar and Michael Lynk, setting the foundation for what is an excellent encapsulation of the issue, but it is such a dismal moment that we need to be speaking on this topic, and that we need to be raising awareness on what needs to be done on something that is so fundamental from a human rights perspective, that we need to not only stand up for human rights, but as Michael mentioned, for human rights defenders who are working in Palestine to do basic things that we wouldn't give a second thought to in a Canadian context. so basic when we're talking about the ability to document human rights abuses, violations. These things need to happen, and we need to have people on the ground speaking out against these things, documenting these things, and standing up for those who are being criminalized. Now, the focus of my comments is going to be on the Canadian context, and I want to talk about two things which sort of provide a bit of the context and some of the failings from a Canadian perspective, and that is discussions that are being had around basically the right, and this is so astonishing that we've been talking about this, but the right essentially to speak in favor of Palestinian human rights in Canada, that is a controversial issue. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the battles, challenges, and successes that we've been having in Canada. This is important, the fact that we in civil society need to be able to speak out about Palestinian human rights, generally speaking, and about the work that's being done on the ground, because this will normalize the fact that Palestinian human rights are human rights, and our government needs to take a position on them. The second thing that I'm going to be talking about is a case that I was involved in about 8 years ago or so in respect of criminalizing a Canadian NGO and humanitarian organization that was delivering humanitarian assistance in Gaza, in Palestine, and was deemed a terrorist entity in Canada. That's the IRFAN Canada organization, the International Relief Fund for the Afflicted and Needy, which was deemed a terrorist organization in 2014. So with respect to just the very idea of speaking out against Israeli apartheid, speaking out against the violation of Palestinian rights that are happening right now at this very moment, there are organizations such as B'nai B'rith, other organizations that support the state of Israel unquestionably, and are attempting to limit free discussion, free expression, and also to tarnish the reputation of human rights defenders in a Canadian context. I want to give you two instances, and I think these are positive examples in a Canadian context where human rights defenders were basically they were exonerated, or their ability to speak out was recognized by Ontario and federal courts. The one example, the first one is in 2019, the Ontario Court of Appeal recognized for a human rights defender here in Canada, Dimitri Lascaris, who was speaking out against, or rather in favor of Palestinians who were simply trying to retrieve the bodies of their children who had been killed by Israeli forces. Because he was speaking about the importance of international human rights, because he was speaking in favor of the rights of Palestinian parents to have access to their children who were extrajudicially killed, B'nai B'rith referred to him as a terrorist supporter. The Ontario Court of Appeal found that Mr. Lascaris' case against B'nai B'rith was appropriately a defamation case, and that case eventually settled. But the important principle is that one can stand up in favor of Palestinian human rights in Canada. That is appropriate, that is recognized by our courts. Another very important case in respect of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers here in Canada that made a statement standing in solidarity with the Palestinian workers, Postal Workers Support Union, and was also attacked by B'nai B'rith. And in that case, it was found that the statements made against CUPW, that they were also in the vein of supporting terrorism, were inappropriate, and those were properly the subject for a civil defamation claim, despite the fact that that free expression, that support of Palestinian human rights was sought to be shut down. So my message there is that although organizations affiliated with or in support of the Israeli state are trying to silence voices of Palestinian human rights and solidarity expression, our courts do support the right to speak in favor of human rights here in Canada. Next, I want to turn to the criminalization of organizations that have supported humanitarian work in Palestine. In 2014, the International Relief Fund for the Afflicted and Needy, IRFAN Canada, was deemed to be a terrorist entity. I represented that organization before the Federal Court of Appeal in an attempt to have its charitable status continued. That was unfortunately an unsuccessful bid before the Federal Court of Appeal, because in the course of our submission to the Federal Court of Appeal back in 2014, they were put on a terrorist list. That is a confidential process that essentially is what they call ex parte, is done behind closed doors. The basis for deeming IRFAN Canada to be a terrorist entity was the fact that it gave material support to Hamas by giving $14.6 million to humanitarian efforts, which somehow were deemed to be in support of Hamas. What I can tell you as a lawyer for IRFAN Canada, in their charities appeal and also in the attempt to have them delisted, is that 13 million of those funds were for medical supplies, things in the nature of dialysis machines, clearly things in kind that were humanitarian basic humanitarian devices, which were not for any other purpose but to support life. With respect to the other $1.6 million, those funds were going to support orphans. They were going to support families for basically humanitarian subsistence. But the fact that they could not, the organization IRFAN Canada could not exercise the due diligence and minute control that the Canada Revenue Agency expected of them, that was deemed to be inappropriate on the part of that organization. Now, the upshot of this is that that organization, now deemed a terrorist entity, has been shut down as a source of humanitarian support for Gaza and Palestine generally. And this coincides with the notion that deeming support of humanitarian effort, and I would say by extension human rights, is seen to be inappropriate, seen to be as funding of terrorism. And that is unfortunately something that we have to deal with. We have to work around that. But what I can say with respect to advocacy, expression of human rights, as Michael Lynk mentioned, there is no debate whatsoever that Canada is committed to the protection of human rights defenders by virtue of Canada's own policies. Now, there is a policy known as the Voices at Risk policy, which is something that is supposed to govern the activities of Global Affairs Canada. That policy enshrines, what should be our government's commitments to organizations like Ademiya, like Al-Haq, like the organizations who are working on the ground in Palestine. They fit verbatim the definition of human rights defenders. And according to our own policies, these are Government of Canada policies, there is a commitment that our government must have, should have, and there should be an intensified effort to have a consistency in approach, rather than criminalizing, rather than shutting down, this advocacy of human rights defense and Palestinian human rights. Our civil society needs to speak out about applying values consistently when we talk about international human rights, when we talk about respect for human rights defenders. This is a black and white situation of violation of the rights of organizations who are documenting and advancing the importance of protection of international human rights and basic economic, social, and political rights in Israel, Palestine. There should be no debate about this, and our Canadian policies provide the foundation of what civil society could and should be doing. Our right to express, our right to lobby our members of parliament and the prime minister is not something that is criminal. Although organizations would attempt to shut that down, as I mentioned before, our courts have recognized that those attempts are inappropriate. And as a civil society, we have a right to defend those interests.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yavar, for that important, critical legal angle, and also on the emphasis around our government here at home. We shouldn't have to say it, but yes, Palestinian rights are human rights. So thank you for calling on us to respect our own policies and protect human rights. Let's insist on consistency, as you say, rather than this double standard that we see when it comes to Palestine. And also, again, to our audience, let's heed this call, this need for civil society in Canada to speak out for Palestine. I look very, very forward to hearing more from you, Yavar, in the Q&A. And for all those who've been asking, yes, we're going to be rebroadcasting this event on both YouTube and Facebook. So anyone who's registered will get that in their inboxes. Please do share it. So that concludes our presentations for this evening/afternoon, and we're now going to be moving on to the Q&A portion. Thanks to the many of you who have posted your questions in the Q&A. I see a few in the chat as well, and let's get right into it. So the first question that we have here is from David Squire, who is wondering, from James Squire rather, who's wondering, is it possible for an individual to donate to these civil society organizations, or will we be charged for aiding and abetting a terrorist organization in Canada? Is there anyone who'd like to take that on? Maybe we can start with you, Yavar.
Certainly. So in terms of the status of these organizations, I can tell you from the example of IRFAN Canada, there is a specific parliamentary, there's a specific process by which entities can be added to the list of terrorist entities in Canada. To my knowledge, that has not happened to those organizations in a Canadian context. The challenge is, and this is where the importance of civil society resistance is paramount, because these organizations could be listed. And I can tell you people can ask me later on, or I can get into it. Part of the reason why IRFAN Canada was listed in the first place was about a history of certain dealings in the United States and how those came to implicate IRFAN Canada inappropriately and by proxy. But I think that what this says is that there's potential for a creep where entities are listed or criminalized in the state of Israel or other countries. And if, for example, the US has a similar outlook to Israel, we can follow shortly behind that. That is a pattern that had happened in the IRFAN Canada case. It could happen again. And one of the ways to push back against it is to send clear messages that these organizations are plainly human rights defenders. There's no question, ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yavar. So the next question we have is from Jenny. Jenny wants to know what motivates the current Canadian government's continued tacit support of Israel's violations of human rights and war crimes. Is it geopolitical? Is it cultural? Is it religious? Is it military? Perhaps we can start with you, Michael.
I think this is the kind of question that where there's a range of answers to. None of them are dominant, but all of them contribute to this. And what I often think of is the statement that was in Barack Obama's 2020 presidential memoir with respect to the United States, because I think what he said with respect to the U.S. is closely applicable to here in Canada. He said that whenever I had to have a critical reaction to or critical conversation with Israel and the Israeli political leadership, I faced a kind of domestic attention and resistance that never happened when I had to have critical conversations with any of our other allies, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Mexico, and so on. He was indicating, and I think it's true in Canada, that it is almost unique to have such a well organized array of organizations that will make their presence known to the political leadership in the U.S. at the White House and in Congress, in Canada, certainly to the Prime Minister and to the leaders of all of the parties. There exists this kind of advocacy for Israel that doesn't exist really for any other of our allies or any other countries in the world. So that is one important reason why. Certainly there seems to be a lot of daylight between the stance of the leadership of our conservative and liberal governments on the one hand with respect to Israel and with respect to popular opinion. Popular opinion in any recent polls seems to indicate that Canadians are much more critical of Israel and Israeli occupation and much more supportive of Palestinian rights than the leadership in the conservative or liberal parties. It's pleasing to me to see that the NDP, after some pushing and some vigorous internal debates, has now come up with, I think, is a very good list of priorities. I think there were 13 altogether, and I believe that it's been posted already on our chats beside as to what they would do and what they want to see. Now, the fact that the NDP has a supply and support agreement with the Liberals, I would like to be able to see the NDP push on at least some of those issues to see a change for the better with respect to a Canadian policy towards Israel and Palestine.
Thank you so much, Michael. Sahar, you mentioned in your discussion the importance of solidarity, and I'm wondering what could Canada do to show leadership on Palestine?
I believe in the power of the people and the joint, coordinated kind of work. So in order to add on what Yavar and Michael were saying, I believe the different organizations, the activists, have a very important role in sending clear messages, because a step by Canada to designate us would be very dangerous. And I should tell you already that I think one Canadian bank refused to channel money to one of the 6 organizations, where it never happened with any other international bank in any other country. The difficulties we are facing is from the Palestinian banks because they are so vulnerable, but any other bank in Europe or even in the United States took such a step, but it was a Canadian bank. So I mean, this threat of being affected directly or indirectly by any policy by the Canadian governments or the Canadian banks, or so criminalized and designated and included in other terror lists, this is realistic. This is gonna happen if we don't stop this now. So please write your MPs, write your government, put pressure on them that should end, that Israel should abide to the international law, and they should stop attacking human rights defenders and violating their rights.
If I can,
and I think,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, please.
All I was going to say is, we've mentioned already during the panel the fact that Canada hasn't raised its voice with respect to criticizing Israeli actions to try to suppress and to close these organizations. We should not only be insisting that Canada raise its voice and join others in the international community who are critical of what Israel is doing with respect to Palestinian Civil Society, but it should resume funding of these organizations directly or indirectly, the way that it did up until about 20 years ago. If we do believe in human rights, as we say we do, if we do recognize the particular role and the precarious role of human rights defenders, then we should not only be speaking out in their defense whenever they're being attacked by an authoritarian government, but we should be actually funding those organizations to allow them to have that kind of critical voice and that appearance of international support in the work that they do.
Thank you, Michael. Sahar.
I just wanted to add, because I noticed someone asking, I don't know the name of the bank, but yes, I think one of the tools that we have, name and shame, or to pull our investments from complicit companies, banks, and so on, if they are complicit in oppressing human rights defenders, or in general are complicit and benefiting from the occupation. This is our role as civil society, to take actions if our governments are not going to take actions, and divestment and sanction is the best way. And we can see how governments now are acting against Russia in the Ukraine war, why it's not working against Israel, why we cannot use the same, why we would be blamed of being anti-Semitic if we are calling for divestment and sanctions where it's used in other contexts.
Thank you, Sahar. So this one is directed at Yavar. You know, in Canada, we know that there's some illegal military recruiting that has taken place of Canadian citizens for the IDF, and this is a campaign that both Just Peace advocates and the CFPI have been trying to raise attention around. Are there other laws, you've talked about some, but are there other laws that our audience should be aware of that Canada needs to be upholding within the context of the Palestinian struggle?
Certainly, and I think Michael gave an excellent primer sort of on the background, which gives voice or provides the facts on the ground for international law, international human rights conventions, whether it's the Geneva Conventions, whether it's forcible displacement of populations, particularly the Fourth Convention, but also the International Civil and Political Rights and the International Civil, Economic, and Social Cultural Rights Conventions, which are things to bear in mind. But the one thing that I'll add, which is interesting, that just happened in the recent weeks, is that now from a Canadian perspective, we've had in the last couple of years 2 very interesting Supreme Court of Canada decisions, which are recognizing customary international law as part of Canadian law. And so basically what this tells us, I mean, Canada is a country that prides itself on human rights generally, and from knowing about the international human rights context, I think where the gap is in applying that consistently to Canadian government actions. And I think what potentially this opens up, and the recent Toussaint case before the Supreme Court of Canada, which basically further opened the door of customary international law coming into the scope of Canadian domestic law, tells us is that when illegal actions are happening that are being directly sanctioned by the Canadian government, or their Canadian policies which enable unlawful acts to take place, there is an opening for potential civil claims, other forms of liability where Canadian government can be challenged, including the potential for judicial review. I'll give one small example. The very important decision of David Kattenberg before the Federal Court of Appeal with respect to wine labeling in the occupied Palestinian territories, where basically the Canadian Food Inspection Agency was called on to revise its policy with respect to not respecting the source origin of wine labeling in the occupied Palestinian territory. So in that sense, there is this increasingly this possibility of using international law, which exists and is quite clear and has been clear for decades. But the new door that's opening is, how do we use those laws in innovative ways to apply them domestically? And I think that there are some options for that.
Thank you so much, Yavar. The next question that I have is for Michael. What is the role of Canadians to influence or demand that Canada support the Palestine cases at the ICC, the International Criminal Court?
Oh, another sad story. Canada was a very prominent supporter in the late 1990s of the 1998 Rome Statute for the creation of the International Criminal Court. And Canada was one of the early large donors to the ICC. And Canada remains obviously a very active member and supporter in general of the International Criminal Court. Again, this exception with respect to Palestine emerges. And we know that in the beginning of 2015, the Palestinians applied for membership. They received membership in the International Criminal Court. Canada vigorously opposed this. Canada's always taken the position that the Palestinians are not a state and no more than an entity under occupation, and therefore can't have membership in UN organizations or in other international institutions. So when subsequently complaints were brought against Israel with respect to for crimes both in Gaza, in the wars of 2014, 2018, and 2021, as well as the designation of Israeli settlements as war crime under the 1998 Rome Statute. Canada has been a fervent opponent all the way through of the ability of the Palestinians to bring these complaints. And it always struck me as odd. Canada proclaims itself as being a strong supporter of international rules-based order and of international law. If we wish the Palestinians to be able to advance their claims for rights and for freedoms through the established institutions of the United Nations and other international institutions, why are we opposing the votes that come every year at the General Assembly? Why are we opposing their applications at the International Criminal Court for membership and then for being able to bring these complaints against Israel? This really sounds like echoes of a policy coming out of Tel Aviv with respect to foreign policy, and Canada's position with respect to Palestine and the International Criminal Court is almost indistinguishable. There's actually virtually no daylight at all between it and Israel's with regards to this. And we know, if I can make a link back to what the purpose of our discussion today is, we know that one of the probably the motivating reasons for wanting to harass and to attack and now to try to close down these 7 Palestinian human rights organizations is the support by some of them with respect to evidence gathering at the for the Hague with the International Criminal Court. This is probably the one biggest possibility of holding Israel accountable with respect to the conduct of its occupation. This has been a 55-year-old occupation with virtually no accountability given by the international community. Israel continues to play chess while the rest of the international community plays checkers with respect to this. The ability of Palestinian civil society to bring these claims to the Hague is seen by Israel as an important strategic threat, and it should be seen by them as an important strategic threat. If the formal investigation endorses some or all of these claims with respect to potential war crimes committed in the various assaults on Gaza and with respect to the settlements. So again, I have to say Canada is probably on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of international law when it comes to this.
Certainly on the wrong side of history. And Sahar, it just sounds like your organization and the other organizations have been targeted because of how impactful your work has been. So, again, another opportunity to just, thank you and shout out these orgs. Please do find out about the work that they're doing. This might be a good time as well. You talked about how indistinguishable Canada's positions are from those of Israel, Michael. John has a question. Could the panelists please comment on the relationship between Canadian foreign policy on Israel, Palestine, and US foreign policy on the same? Are there differences? And Sahar, have you noticed any difference between Canada's sort of engagement with Palestine and the US's?
I don't think I have much to add. I don't feel there is a serious change definitely not from the side of Canada. On the US level, the only a very small change that this report or the position of the CIA was leaked, that they also didn't took the secret information as accurate, but unfortunately didn't brought a very clear decision by the State Department that they are not going to designate, or they are keep hiding behind the fact that the US actually is not funding any of these 7 organizations. So the official position that they don't fund, so it's not like if it's not their business. But I hope that also the civil society in the United States will make difference by the campaign that is initiated there in support of the civil society organizations. Because as I said, if the US is not taking a clear position and requesting Israel to cancel this designation, I don't think we will be safe and things will deteriorate.
Thank you, Sahar. Would anyone else like to comment on that? If not, I'm going to a question from Eileen. That's for Professor Lynk. You were in Ireland recently. Do you know why the Irish government is blocking the Occupied Territories Bill? Are they being pressured by the US?
Thank you for that. I've been to Ireland twice this year, and I have the greatest of admiration for Irish civil society. I've got to say that the work done by Irish civil society to steer Ireland as being probably the most progressive voice within the European Union and in Europe on Israel and Palestine has been astonishing. It may not be so astonishing, actually, when you think this comes from a country that certainly knows colonialism and knows occupation at the blunt end of British imperial rule. So it perhaps is not surprising that Palestine is such an important issue in Irish domestic politics. There presently are 7 political parties represented in the Irish Dáil or Parliament, and 6 of those 7 parties have made Palestine an important central feature in their foreign policy, and is why 2 years ago they passed an extraordinary resolution in support of Palestine in the Dáil, and use words like illegal occupation, which has forced their very conservative party that's in the primary lead in the coalition to be able to make comments and to have a very good voting record in the UN. You've asked me specifically about the Occupied Territories Bill. As I understand it, the Occupied Territories Bill has gone through 10 of the 12 stages it takes in order to become law in Ireland. And the bill, if passed, would therefore ban goods and services and products coming from any illegal civilian settlements in any occupied territory to enter into the Irish market. The Irish government and the lead party in the Irish coalition governing Ireland has said, this is not our jurisdiction. We can't do this as an individual country. This only can occur at the EU level. There's certainly legal opinions going the other way with respect to this, but I don't doubt, certainly from what I've been told by Irish civil society, that that pressure from the United States has been a significant feature in the calculation of the Irish government to try to bring if you like, a procedural issue to try to block the passage of Occupied Territories Bill. And if I can say one more thing, I think what the Irish have tried to do in adopting the Occupied Territories Bill, and it still may come up sometime during the life of this current government in the Irish Dáil, is that this is something we should try to emulate in Canada. We should be, particularly now with this new statement coming from the NDP, we should be trying to seek the introduction of a bill, likely through then as a private member's bill in the Canadian Parliament, modeled after the Irish bill, to try to ban the entry into Canada of goods and services coming from any illegal civilian settlement anywhere in occupied territory. That would include Palestine, that would include Northern Cyprus, it would include Western Sahara, it would include Crimea, it would include anywhere where there's an occupation and civilians settling those areas in support of conquest by the occupying power.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to shift now to some current events in Canada around the key. We have two questions, which I'll just ask one after another. What could the impact be of Jagmeet Singh's recent comments on Palestine? And Marie wants to know, was the NDP repositioning on Israel-Palestine possibly symptomatic of a broader shift in Canada, or will a backlash occur, or both? Maybe I'll start with you, Yavar.
Good questions. And maybe I'll start with the second one, and then just sort of my off the cuff remarks, whether a backlash might occur. I mean, I would like to be optimistic about it, and sort of drawing on Sahar's comments from before, that you know, if something is going to shift here, civil society resisting and taking the cue from political leaders that are opening up the space for that kind of voice, that is the opportunity to do so. So could there be a backlash? I think there could always be a backlash. What I've indicated is that at least in some court decisions where, as Michael mentioned, in the US context, in the Canadian context, there is a very strong Zionist lobby that is very much organized to stifle discussion, debate, and support for Palestinian human rights. And I think that the courts have said repeatedly that that is an appropriate area of expression. So I think that the space is there, it's legally protected. Having the politicians to have the courage to make statements that would allow for civil society to further their position, I think that's what we need more of. So there's always the potential for backlash, but I'd like to think that we could use this momentum and the legal wins that we've had to continue and build on that.
Thank you, Yavar.
If I can just add quickly to that. I mean, think of the things that are on our side. First of all, the Palestinians and the Palestinian people are not going to give up with respect to this. They have shown great tenacity. International law is on our side. International public opinion is on our side. UN resolutions are on our side. There's so many things to be optimistic about in the face of very grim realities with respect to the occupation. We all know the famous quote by Martin Luther King Jr., who said, the arc of history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. We don't often remember what the Reverend Jesse Jackson then added to that. He said, the arc of history bends towards justice, but we have to make it bend. So that is that's the direction that all of us in civil society have to follow in order to be able to do that. And it is bending. When you look at someone like Sahar and the work that she does, or what Al-Haq does, or any of the other Palestinian organizations, together with a number of very brave Israeli human rights organizations that work as well. These Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations are the bridge to the future, I think, of a more equitable society in Israel-Palestine that's going to respect the rights of all and guide us towards a better political future.
I see that I think Jonathan Kutab is here from Al-Haq. Would be great to hear a little bit from you, Jonathan, before we conclude our Q&A session. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. I'm actually at a public place, so I wouldn't be able to say too much other than I'm very glad to be in such august company. Professor Lynk and Sahar and Yavar have all done wonderful work, and I appreciate everything that you are doing. And Karen also is on this call. If I needed, I'd be willing to participate, but I do not want to repeat what has already been said.
Oh, thank you. It's just really wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for the incredible work of Al-Haq, and it's utterly reprehensible what has happened, and I can only imagine what you're going through and how busy you all are right now. So we'll continue with questions. Please do join in on the question period. We have a few more questions coming in. Is that Susan? Hi, Susan. Welcome to our discussion.
Hello.
Q&A period. Did you want to say a few words before we get a few more questions from our audience?
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies we had a bit of a mix-up with our schedule. Just in terms of the seriousness of the situation as it stands right now, the attacks on the organizations are absolutely unprecedented. And we're coming to a point where we're seeing the dismantling of the entirety of Palestinian civil society. And we see these as acts and continuing acts of apartheid and persecution, and that these acts against the Palestinian organizations and against Palestinians in the organizations are inhumane acts of persecution and apartheid, and are part of the broader regime of discrimination and maintaining Israeli Jewish domination over the Palestinian people. For Al-Haq, the organization that I work for, we are still continuing our work, but we're working under very serious conditions now. Our General Director, Shawan Jabareen, had been summoned and threatened with arrest and imprisonment if we continue our work. So we're expecting that there could be arbitrary arrests and detentions of the General Director and perhaps maybe other staff as well. And at this point, it really is critical that there would be that the designation is rescinded. And at this point, it's a matter of political pressure from third states to pressure Israel to rescind the designation. At this point, aside from the imminent arrests that we might potentially see, the other grave issue facing our organizations is funding coming into the organizations, because now with the designation being permanent, as it was made permanent when we lost the appeal the day before the raids, this comes into effect with Israel's Counterterrorism Bureau, the Financing Counterterrorism Bureau. And now we might see funds that are coming to our organizations being blocked through the banking system. So we're now in a very serious and critical situation in terms of even the viability and the continuation of our organizations. So it really is an emergency situation. I think it's also important to point out that the designations themselves are based on a counterterrorism legislation, which the Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Committee, in its concluding observations to Israel, found breached principles of legal certainty, principles of necessity, principles of proportionality. So we can say now that these designations are premised on a law which in itself should be struck down for being incompatible with human rights treaties and norms. So it's already built on a very problematic principle of law. So we would ask that third states would not recognize these designations and not recognize even the law on which it is premised. So it is absolutely unsound. And also for third states, third states and other organizations, when they're financing and funding Palestinian human rights organizations, that they remove terrorism clauses from their funding and from their documents that they enter into with Palestinian organizations, because we know that the designations are arbitrary and even the legislation on which they're premised is incompatible with international human rights law. So it really is important that these designations are not recognized, and also they're called out as acts of persecution and apartheid, and also that the very premise and the very law on which they're based is unsound. And we really do need international action on this. We've never been in this situation before, where it is such a fragile and critical and tense state for our human rights organizations. And I leave the floor open to questions. My sincere apologies for the mix-up.
Thank you so much, Susan. No, it's completely understandable. Susan Power is the head of, sorry, I didn't introduce you. Susan Power is the head of legal advocacy and research at Al-Haq. It is truly terrible to hear about what's happening at Al-Haq to Shawan. It is a clear emergency, as you said. To our audience members, please find out how you can support Al-Haq and Ademiya. We're here in solidarity. And also we need to heed the importance of the Canadian government putting pressure around the rescinding of these designations, right? And Susan, I really heard you when you said that these need to be understood as acts of persecution and apartheid as well. So we do have a few questions from the audience. David Comerford wants to know, can Canadian civil society do more to put pressure on the Canadian government? Can we convince the big NGOs to take a clear stance? Can we get more academic institutions to take a clear stance? Will any of this move the Canadian government to change its policies and its unconditional support of Israel? And Susan, perhaps I'll ask you first, as you haven't had an opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's important that the pressure comes at all different strands of society. I think that academic engagement is critically important. And I think what Israel does well, for example, is trying to base these very unjust acts on a legal basis and on a legal footing. So, for example, we see this counterterrorism, we see these designations built on the counterterrorism law, but there's also very fundamentally egregious breaches of international law that we're seeing. So even in the complaint that Al-Haq brought before the Israeli military attorney, the complaint came back based on evidence that was secret evidence and confidential and wasn't going to be revealed. And the cases that were cited in this complaint and in the decision were Israeli High Court of Justice cases, which preside over really abhorrent practices such as secret evidence, and there's no due process, and there's no guarantees of fair procedure in these kinds of in this court system. And I think it's really important that that academics come in and deconstruct, the various issues that are happening here and highlight it and also put pressure to bear. We had engaged with a university, with the University Law Clinic when we were submitting to the Human Rights Committee and doing that very deep legal analysis, of the counterterrorism legislation, and it was so important to get those concluding observations, university clinics and with university professionals for highlighting it, and for also raising awareness, and also for the academic community to come out with a statement, I think would be very powerful. That was signed on and had very wide support. And this is another way to leverage support and push for support politically as well. And I think this is the kind of pressure that we need to see. We need to see academics leading on this. We need civil society engaged internationally, and everything that we can do to bring pressure to bear on third states to pressure Israel. And we know that this begins and ends with third states. So like the role of Canada is so important here, and it really is critical.
Thank you, Susan. Does anyone else care to comment on the question of civil society in Canada? We have some queries from the audience around recordings of this entire webinar. Yes, everybody that has registered for this webinar will be receiving a copy. We're going to also upload it to YouTube. It's also on Facebook, so please do actually share this far and wide. So lots of very important information. Also, any resources that have been shared by us in the chat, we will also include in an email that will go out to all registrants, so you can relax. You're going to get all of the information, and please do take all of the actions, and please do support these 7 groups, including Al-Haq and Ademiya. So we heard a little bit about the Zionist lobby and backlash from you, Yavar, a little bit earlier. And Tina has a question, and I think it's relevant. You know, we have the right to speak out, says Tina. However, it does not stop groups like B'nai B'rith from taking people to court or dragging them through the mud. How do we stop this and protect ourselves? Not everyone has the money to go to court for frivolous or illegal reasons. And I think this is also in respect to these designations and wanting to support these groups. Do you have any thoughts on this, Yavar? Perhaps we can hear from you first, and anyone else as well.
Certainly. So 2 thoughts that I have. I think one is that it's just sort of lamentable, the fact that we're actually mired in these free speech debates when there are really critical issues of funding and support that just need to happen. Unfortunately, that's the reality of where we're at. But as I've indicated before, and people have questions, they can ask me. That there are a couple of good decisions, at least in Ontario and other provinces in Canada have similar legislation that prevents against strategic litigation that's designed to shut down free speech. And so where organizations like B'nai B'rith may start a legal action on defamation, that can be challenged under anti-SLAPP legislation. And there are advocates across the country who may be willing to provide advice or strategic direction to individuals or organizations who are faced in that situation. I do agree, civil litigation is always costly, but increasingly with the tenor of judicial decisions that are finding these kinds of defamation claims as strategic and not appropriate for the courts, there is jurisprudence that we can rely upon. I think as well, we need to point to those decisions. We need to point to civil momentum, and there is increasingly so much expression and so much good advocacy that's being done, and we need to point to that work, because all of that expression cannot be shut down, and it is happening. We just need to draw on the momentum of what good organizations are doing, because I believe that these strategic lawsuits will ultimately fail because the tenor of the jurisprudence doesn't support it.
Thank you so much. We're drawing to the end of our time together. I did want to just ask Sahar and Susan, what can people do very directly to support your 2 organizations? We can start with you, Sahar, and then Susan.
Again, I like always also the fund and all the support that you can think is needed, but of course be careful, and I'm aware for the difficulties that people can face in Canada as well, but please, the huge support we need is putting pressure on the Canadian political decision-making level in order to take a clear position against this designation, and in order to protect and implement all the international law and human rights standards when it comes for protection of human rights defenders and human rights.
Thank you, Sahar. Susan?
Yeah, I think as well, I just want to echo, what Sahar said. At the end of the day, like we're facing the dismantling of our organizations and the closure of our organizations, and a permanent targeting of Palestinian voices in civil society on the ground. And it really is very, very critical. I mean, 3 of the organizations that are targeted are are working with the International Criminal Court, and we're submitting evidence to the International Criminal Court. So there's a very key role that the organizations are playing here, and like we do believe that that some of these the attack is intended to directly target this work. So members of the states that are members of the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court have obligations as well under the Rome Statute, you know, to ensure that evidence is protected, and also to ensure that the process with the Office of the Prosecutor, that all of this investigation is respected as well. And our organizations are playing a pivotal part, you know, in working, you know, and coordinating with the International Criminal Court. But also, you know, at the level of the designations, like, it really is important that these are rescinded. And we would ask that people take action on the ground, contact your local representative. There was a motion before, I think, which didn't carry in Canada. And this is something maybe we'd like to see, maybe something pushed forward again, a motion or a resolution, you know, protecting the organizations and ensuring that finances as well would be, and our finances would be protected. And I think that's of critical importance now. But everything now is at the political level, and it really is at a very, very serious and grave stage. And it's not just our organizations. We're the first batch of organizations. Let's make this crystal clear. This is going to be an expanding circle of organizations that will be targeted. So it's very, very serious. And we're really coming now towards like the final point in Israel's colonization, and we're at the precipice of no return. And when there is no voice to speak out against this, there's no voice on the ground calling out human rights violations, this gives Israel the green light to aggressively finalize its colonization process. So it really is very, very critical that third states intervene and pressure Israel to rescind the designations, and that people on the ground in third states and in Canada in particular really pressure your local representatives and get political pressure to bear on your local representatives. And we really would ask this.
Thank you, Susan. This is terrifying stuff. It's terrifying stuff. Now is the time to support these organizations. Now is the time for us to show our solidarity. As Susan and Sahar have outlined, this is a very critical moment within the context of this colonization process. Michael, you had talked at one point about being optimistic. Just going to take one last question, which is from David Kattenberg, who was mentioned earlier by Yavar for the case that he had against Israeli wine. And his question is the tide turning? And maybe we'll start with Michael, and if anyone else wants to chime in, please do.
Very, very briefly, at the beginning or even in the middle of an immense struggle, such as the Palestinian struggle, it's sometimes hard to see where the light is coming from. It's sometimes very hard to be optimistic. And I thought when I think of my time as special rapporteur over the 6 years that I was there, the reason why I got up every morning, the reason why I think I was able to put in the energy that I was able to put into that particular work is because of people like Shawan or Sahar or Jonathan or Susan, because I knew they were struggling with much greater odds than I would ever wind up facing for rights and freedoms and self-determination. And whenever I see the kind of energy that each of them winds up projecting, with respect to wanting to defend that human rights space, with wanting to make sure that their criticism is both fearless and responsible, and for the unity that they're showing with human rights movements in the region and elsewhere in the world. That's the reason why we ought to be optimistic with respect to this. And that's why I think, even if we can't always see the undercurrents going on, that the tide is turning. Because the world has gotten to a position with respect to this modern human rights era that we measure things through that particular lens. And whenever these organizations ask us to look at the lens of the Israeli occupation through human rights and international law framework, they see, we're going to see what they wind up seeing. So that's why I think the tide is inevitably going to wind up turning.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. I think that is an excellent note on which to end our discussion today. I want to thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you, Sahar. Thank you, Susan. Please find out how to support these critical, vital organizations. Thank you to Michael and Yavar as well, and Jonathan, for your tireless defense of Palestinian human rights. Again, please find out about the work of our panelists and their organizations. Also just want to ask you again to share our action alert, take action. Share our action alert calling on the Canadian government to hold Israel accountable for the mistreatment of children in Palestine and for silencing these organizations that advocate on their behalf. Once again, thank you to our brilliant panelists, amazing organizers, activists, speakers, human rights defenders, Michael, Sahar, Susan. It's been incredible to have you here, and Yavar. So that's it for our event. Thanks to our audience for your excellent questions, and goodbye, everyone, and peace.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.